Howdy, my name is Vanessa Corriher-Olsen. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension located in Overton, Texas. Today, my topic is to talk about hay varieties that are adapted and productive for Central and East Texas. So first and foremost, anytime we are talking about forage species and varieties, we need to make sure that we are selecting species and varieties that are adapted to our location. So it's very important to understand where your property is located in the state, not only in regards to rainfall, but also in regards to soil type. Many of our species and varieties can be sensitive to poorly drained or well-drained soils, or drought tolerant or not drought tolerant. So we want to make sure we're selecting species and varieties that are adapted to our location so that it's worth our investment in establishing those and then utilizing those for hay production. A great place to start in regards to making some of those decisions is the USDA WebSoul Survey. So this is a free resource. The best way to locate it is just to Google WebSoul Survey. You can push that green start button that you see there on the screen, and it will actually take you to the survey. From there, you can enter in a street address if you have a street address for that location, or you can put in GPS coordinates. If you don't know the GPS coordinates for your property, you can use the map app on your smartphone. You can also use Google Earth, which is a free download onto your computer or iPad, or even probably to your smartphone. And with Google Earth, you can determine your longitude and latitude based on your current location. So once you have that information in there, the map will hone in onto your location. You can select a hay meadow that you're looking to potentially improve productivity or change the forage species. And it will tell you the different soil types, whether it's a well-drained location or a poorly drained location. So it's an excellent tool. It's very easy to use. There's a step-by-step guide on this website, so you don't necessarily feel overwhelmed or lost as you embark on this resource. So as we start to talk about forages for hay production, obviously we're going to focus on the grasses. So we can harvest legumes such as alfalfa and otherwise are often harvested for hay, but they're just a little bit more challenging. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation today. But we're going to focus on our grasses. So we have annual and perennial grasses. We'll talk about both, specifically focusing on our warm seasons. I will mention our cool season annual rye grass. That is often harvested for hay, either because it has volunteered in a hay meadow, or we're trying to reduce the production of annual ryegrass in a pasture, as we're allowing our warm seasons Bermuda grass or Baja grass to break dormancy. So we're going to start with looking at the difference in nutritive value. That's going to be very important in regards to our selection of our forage species or variety for hay production, because obviously we're producing hay to meet the needs of livestock, whether it's our own animals that we are feeding, or if we're trying to market our product to a specific consumer, and whether it's a cow-calf operation or we're trying to market hay to some horse owners. So when we look at our forage species, our cool season forages, be it annual ryegrass or our small grains, are naturally going to be higher in nutritive value than our warm seasons. So that's an opportunity to harvest a high nutritive value forage. Now, there are challenges, of course, with harvesting cool season forages. For most of us in Texas, that is typically during kind of the late winter, early spring time period, when we do tend to have quite a bit of moisture. So harvesting those for a dry hay crop can be fairly challenging. But those cool seasons are going to be higher in nutritive value than our warm seasons. Then when we look at growth, our annuals are going to be higher in nutritive value than our perennials. So just the nature of those plants, they germinate from seed and complete their life cycle in a single season, as opposed to perennials have to build up quite a bit of fiber that's fairly indigestible by livestock in order to persist or stand within a field for multiple years. So our annuals are going to be higher nutritive values than our perennials. So of course, for the majority of the southeastern part of the United States and In Texas, Bermuda grass is basically one of our primary hay species that's heavily utilized for hay production in Texas. So a lot of people always want to know, well, how does something compare to Bermuda grass, especially hybrid Bermuda grass? So first and foremost, Bermuda grass is not native to the state of Texas, not even common Bermuda grass. It is an introduced species, so it was introduced into the United States, and definitely introduced into Texas as a potential forage for livestock. So when we compare hybrid Bermuda grass, those that have to be established vegetatively, they do not produce substantial enough seed for planting by seed and germination, so they have to be established by vegetative material. That may be sprigs or tops potentially. So if we're comparing hybrid Bermuda grass to Baja grass, it will really depend on the variety. So Baja grass in regards to nutritive value is very similar to coastal Bermuda grass. And we'll talk about some other pros and cons to Baja grass a little bit later. The Tifton 85 of our Bermuda grass varieties, Tifton 85 is the highest in nutritive value as long as it is managed appropriately. So obviously there's a lot of other factors that influence nutritive value of our forages: harvesting time, harvesting method, storage, etc. When we compare crabgrass, now majority of people view crabgrass as undesirable as a weed. It is actually higher in nutritive value even than hybrid Bermuda grass, even higher nutritive value than Tifton 85. Because it is a warm season annual, that is why it is higher in nutritive value. Now, unfortunately, it is, of course, challenging as far as hay production because it does have a thicker stem and thicker leaf, so it takes longer for crabgrass to cure for a dry hay product compared to Bermuda grass. So it is often viewed as a weed or undesirable plant in a Bermuda grass hay meadow because it extends that curing time, which leads to the risk of having hay that's on the ground rained on and losing some of that nutritive value. Our other warm season annual Sudan grass is going to be higher in nutritive value than our hybrid Bermuda grass. And then, of course, our cool season annuals, Rye Grass and small grains, are going to be higher in nutritive value than Bermuda grass. But there's, of course, with all forage species and varieties, there are pros and cons in regards to their utilization. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about some of those as we go through these different species and some variety information. So you do have to select a species and variety that matches your location, as well as your production system goals, what you are trying to achieve, and then what you are willing to work with or work against to have success in your hay production. So our warm season perennials are, like I mentioned, more commonly used for hay production because they do not have to be established on a regular basis or an annual basis. Once they are established, as long as we are managing them appropriately, they will persist for multiple years. And they are well adapted to our warm temperatures, higher temperatures throughout the Southeast and in Texas. They break dormancy typically following our last frost, which depending on where you are in the state may be early to mid-March or potentially later if you're further north. And then they'll start actively growing mid-March, mid to late March, early April. Their growth will slow when our night temperatures drop below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where they go into a winter dormant period. And they will turn brown or go dormant with the first killing frost, or first frost, which on average at least for me in East Texas, is about November 15th. But our warm season perennials, such as Bermuda grass and Baja grass, tend to be the foundation for most of our forage systems throughout the southeast of the United States, including Texas. So to look at their growth rate and production, obviously they break dormancy in March, start actively growing, very productive throughout the summer. Their production may drop in the high temperatures in July and August, as well as potential drought periods. But then with some cooler temperatures and potential for moisture, they'll actually increase in growth right there prior to before our frost there in November. So Bermuda grass, very popular throughout the Southeast. Like I mentioned, it is not native to the state of Texas. It is well adapted to our well-drained soils, especially our deep sandy soils in parts of Central and East Texas, is well adapted to some of our heavier soils, but some varieties can be very picky in regards to which soils they do better in. Coastal and Tipton 85 do tend to perform better and persist better in soils that do have some level of sand or well-drained locations. Jigs Bermuda grass is well adapted to poorly drained soils. So if we get into a bottom, the Trinity bottom, or down around Beaumont, almost into rice country where they have a lot of saturated locations, Jigs Bermuda grass will do very well in that environment. Bermuda grass is very drought tolerant. Now, of course, that drought tolerance will be dependent on fertilization as well as management over its lifetime. It does produce both above ground stolons and rhizomes, which are below ground shoots that move laterally to produce new plants. So it does create a very dense ground cover and will tolerate close continuous grazing. And we have both vegetative or hybrid varieties of Bermuda grass and then varieties that can be established by seed. Of our Bermuda grass varieties, Tipton 85, like I mentioned, it has the highest nutritive value than any of our other warm season perennial grasses. Some disadvantages of Bermuda grass are hybrid varieties such as Tipton 85, Coastal, Jigs, Tipton 44, Alicia, Russell have to be established vegetatively, either from sprigs, dormant plant material, or tops. Because they are very productive and higher in nutritive value, they will require a certain level of fertilizer in order for us to have persistence of stands so that we have them for multiple years. Those stolons, those above ground shoots, produce a tight side. That can be challenging in a pasture situation if you're trying to overseed with cool season forages. But that doesn't mean that we're not able to be successful by using a light disking to do so. This is just a visual comparison of common Bermuda grass on the left and Tipton 85 on the right. Tipton 85 has a thicker stem and a broader leaf. It is often perceived by some livestock producers that Tipton 85 is not very valuable because it does appear to be very stemmy. It has a lower leaf to stem ratio, meaning that there's almost more stem area compared to leaf area. The majority of our nutritive value is found in the leaf material of our plants. However, because of some unique characteristics of Tipton 85, it is actually still higher in digestibility compared to many of our other varieties of Bermuda grass, specifically coastal Bermuda grass. So this is a study that was performed by Dr. Glenn Burton at the University of Georgia. He is actually responsible for both coastal and Tipton 85 Bermuda grass. So this is a comparison of various Bermuda grass varieties, comparing them back to coastal. So coastal was released in 1943. About 50 years later, in 1993, Tipton 85 was released as a hybrid variety. So you'll notice the blue bars are for yield. The red bar is for digestibility or energy value of those forages. And if you look at the coastal bars, both are set at 100%. So we are measuring or comparing, say, Tipton 85 back to coastal Bermuda grass. So if we compare Tipton 85 to coastal, Tipton 85 is much more productive, produces higher yields, as well as has higher digestibility or energy value compared to coastal. Now, of course, both of those are going to be influenced by other factors. Fertilization will influence yield, harvesting time will influence digestibility. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Management will have a key impact on the production and quality of the forages that we produce. So next is Baja grass. A lot of folks do view Baja grass as undesirable as a weed. As far as a forage for hay, Baja grass is well adapted throughout the southeast. It's especially well adapted to our very sandy soils in areas where rainfall exceeds 30 to 35 inches. Baja grass is not drought tolerant. During the drought of 2011, Baja grass turned brown or went dormant well before Bermuda grass did. So a lot of people were hopeful that took out their Baja grass. However, And that was not necessarily the case. Bahia grass is a prolific seed producer, which is helpful if you're trying to maintain a stand of Bahia grass. However, because it is a prolific seed producer, even if the drought took out some of those plants, it was able to come back once there was rainfall. Bahia grass also creates a close, tight sod in regards to its ability to tolerate close grazing, and it will persist without fertilization, so that can be an advantage. However, in regards to harvesting Bahia grass for hay, has very stemmy, it has a very tough stem, which can be damaging to equipment. It also matures very quickly, so that can diminish the nutritive value faster than maybe it might be able to be harvested. There are some producers that do harvest Bahia grass for hay, but it is probably more commonly utilized for a grazing situation or for pasture. Like I mentioned earlier, nutritive value will be comparable to bermuda grass. So that that may or may not be your desired choice in regards to hay production, depending on your particular goals. A lot of producers do not want to introduce Bahia grass onto their properties, so they may be less likely to purchase Bahia grass if they're trying to keep it out of their pastures or out of their own hay meadows for that matter. Johnson grass is another warm season perennial that is often perceived as undesirable as a weed. I'll probably spend more time answering questions on how to control Johnson grass as opposed to how to actually grow it. Johnson grass is well adapted to sandy loam and even clay loam soils in Central and East Texas. We do tend to see Johnson grass in a lot of areas that are poorly managed, that are not grazed, so it is highly palatable. Cattle will can graze Johnson grass out of a pasture system. They'll actually select Johnson grass over Bermuda grass often. So it does not tolerate close continuous grazing. That's why we may not see Johnson grass often in pastures that are grazed on a routine basis. Any that pops up, livestock probably take it out before it has an opportunity to really take hold. There can be some toxicity concerns with Johnson grass. Nitrate poisoning and prussic acid poisoning. Nitrate poisoning would occur if we have had high volumes of nitrogen, applied to that Johnson grass, and an event such as a drought or a freeze has reduced or limited growth of that Johnson grass. And so that plant has pulled a lot of that nitrogen into its system without actually growing and converting that nitrogen ultimately to amino acids and then to protein. So if that is a concern, that may be a bigger concern, especially in a hay production system where we are generally putting out higher rates of nitrogen to promote that next harvest. We just want to make sure we allow enough time for that plant once we have rainfall or warmer temperatures to promote growth, that we have allocated enough time for that plant to actually utilize that nitrogen so that forage is no longer potentially toxic to our livestock. If Johnson grass has been harvested as a dry hay product and that has high levels of nitrogen that can result in nitrate poisoning, unfortunately, that risk will not diminish in a harvested forage with any amount of time. So if you are concerned about nitrate poisoning in Johnson grass, you can have that hay tested at our soil forage and water testing lab in College Station, and then speak with a ruminant nutritionist or a nutritionist for your livestock in regards to how to potentially feed that product if it is high in nitrates. Prussic acid poisoning is fairly similar to nitrate poisoning. It does tend to occur following events that have caused stress, drought especially. We're still learning a lot or seeking additional information in regards to prussic acid poisoning risk following a frost. The one advantage of prussic acid poisoning, if you have harvested Johnson grass that is high in prussic acid, that will actually diminish over time in a hay product. So your risk of prussic acid poisoning in a hay product will go down the longer you delay feeding that product potentially. It can be utilized for grazing or haying. Johnson grass does have a thicker stem and leaf than, say, Bermuda grass or Baja grass. So curing time may be a little bit longer than what you might be used to. You could potentially use a mower conditioner to try to break those stems to expedite that curing process. And like I mentioned, a lot of livestock, especially cattle, will select Johnson grass over Bermuda grass or even Baja grass. So it can be a valuable forage as a hay product. Moving into our warm season annuals, they are probably not as often used for hay production because they can be very expensive to establish in regards to seed cost, and it is a forage that has to be established on a yearly or an annual basis. They are very productive, but their productivity is going to be highly dependent on moisture and fertilization. We typically would plant these species in April to May. And then within about 60 days, if we've had moisture and fertilization, we could expect some forage production that could ultimately be harvested for hay or grazed. Now, they can be difficult to graze because their production is highly dependent on rainfall and requires a lot of flexibility. So they are actually they can easily be used for hay production. Now, many of these forage species, as we look at some pictures of these different forage species, they do have a very thick stem and thick leaf and would absolutely require a mower conditioner to expedite that curing time for a dry hay product. But it may be an option for you. You may have that implement and it may fit your production system very well. Just remember, these warm season annuals are going to be higher in nutritive value than our warm season perennials, but their production will be very dependent on rainfall and fertilization. So pearl millet, one of our first warm season annuals, is better adapted to our sandy soils in East Texas or on the eastern side of Central Texas, where we have a lot of sand and potentially acidic soils. It has finer stems than sorghum Sudan grass. Here's an image, some livestock actually grazing pearl millet. As you can see, compared to something like Bermuda grass, it does have very thick, very wide stems. Pearl millet can produce potentially 2 to 6 tons per acre of forage, obviously dependent on rainfall and fertilization. So we do have forage sorghums. There's straight forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. Both are better adapted to our loam or clay soils in central Texas. Sorghums, similar to Johnson grass. Johnson grass is actually in the sorghum family, are also prone to nitrates and prussic acid toxicity. Pearl millet does have the risk of nitrate toxicity, but does not have the concern with prussic acid toxicity that our sorghums can have. Sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, of our warm season annuals, they do have the highest yield potential, so they would be an excellent option for hay production. However, they are more severely affected by drought compared to pearl millet, so that can be a concern for us in Texas in the summer. And they are not very tolerant of poor soil conditions or acidic soils. So for those of us with very sandy soils in East Texas that tend to have a low soil pH, they do not necessarily do very well. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially if you were potentially going to be marketing hay to equine or horse owners, sorghum Sudan grass is not recommended for horses. So I would definitely recommend sticking with Bermuda grass for horses when we're looking at hay production. Coastal and Tifton 85 are highly recommended for equine and highly sought out after by equine owners. There's an unidentified toxin in sorghum Sudan grass that can ultimately cause paralysis of horses. So once again, just a reminder, do not recommend sorghum Sudan grass hybrids or sorghum Sudan grass period for equine. Excuse me. Here's a picture of sorghum Sudan grass. You can see closer that thicker stem that would require that mower conditioner for curing for a dry hay product. Our forage sorghums look fairly similar to the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, but they do have substantial a little bit more grain production compared, and a little bit thicker stem and leaf compared to the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. Now they do have less grain production, of course, compared to our grain sorghums. There are brown midrib hybrids that improves digestibility and of forage sorghums, so that can add to the nutritive value or improve the nutritive value of these forages for hay production. Sudan grass of our warm season annuals has a finer stem and finer leaf. We'll see here shortly in a picture. It does have lower yields than pearl millet or sorghum Sudan hybrids, but it can still be an option for hay production. Um, Average production on Sudan grass is about 2 to 6 tons per acre. Average production on pearl millet is probably about the same, 2 to 6 tons per acre, but you could likely have multiple harvests on the Sudan grass and even maybe on the pearl millet. That will be dependent on your harvesting height if you're going to be harvesting those for hay. Here you can see Sudan grass is much finer stem and leaf compared to our sorghum Sudan hybrids or forage sorghums. Crabgrass, like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about nutritive value comparing species and varieties, like I said, most people think of crabgrass as a weed, as an undesirable plant or undesirable grass within their forage systems in Texas. One of my recommendations if you have crabgrass in a pasture is just to let your cattle graze it. If you have enough grazing pressure, they'll actually graze the crabgrass out. And since it's an annual, it has to germinate from seed. So if we can prevent it from producing seed, then we're going to reduce the risk of that weed or crabgrass coming back into that pasture system. However, crabgrass is higher in nutritive value than bermuda grass or Baja grass, so it is can be a very valuable forage for us in Texas. And there are a lot of states, locations in Oklahoma and other states where they do actually harvest crabgrass for hay or utilize it for grazing for livestock. So it can be an option. If it is going to be harvested for hay, it will take longer to cure compared to bermuda grass. So you will have to be mindful of that and pay attention to weather conditions to be successful in harvesting and baling of crabgrass. Here's a picture of crabgrass. If you're just curious, if you haven't come across it before, it does have a thicker stem and a broader leaf than bermuda grass. That's why it takes longer to cure. A warm season annual that recently I've had several questions about is Tuff. It is related to weeping lovegrass, so it looks fairly similar. It's very fine-leaved and stemmed. It's a very pretty forage. I've actually planted some in plots in East Texas. It is well adapted to a variety of soil types. It did fairly well in East Texas in our sandy soils. Some of the biggest challenges with Tuff as a forage, some challenges as far as hay production. It is not very competitive against weeds, so weed control during establishment will be critical. Planting it into a clean, prepared seed bed will be critical, and then weed control between harvests will be important. Another thing to keep in mind, especially with many of these annuals, to have regrowth for additional hay cuttings or multiple hay harvests, you will have to set your mower, your cutter height a little bit taller than what you might on bermuda grass or Baja grass. So you would have to maintain a stubble height of a minimal 3 to 4 inches, for Tuff in order to have multiple harvests. It is viable that you could have up to 3 cuts per year on Tuff if you have moisture, fertilization, and you are leaving substantial stubble height between those hay harvests. So that is an option. There is potential. Another thing to keep in mind with Tuff as a warm season annual for hay, cutting time will be critical. The recommended timing for harvesting on Tuff is in the boot stage. So that is when the seed head is still kind of encapsulated by a leaf and it's not fully exposed. If it gets too mature, that will obviously influence our nutritive value, but Tuff is at risk of lodging. I had that experience with some plots in East Texas. We had quite a bit of rainfall. I wasn't able to harvest my plots at the appropriate time, and then they lodged, and that made them impossible to harvest at that point. So that will be very important to try to time it appropriately to prevent lodging. I just wanted to show this very quickly. the different seeding rates for our different warm season annuals. Whether you are drilling or broadcasting, those rates will be a little bit different. It is recommended to establish any of these warm season annuals into a clean prepared seed bed where there is no competition. If there is any competition from weeds or warm season perennials, bermuda grass or Baja grass, you will have poor success with establishment and an impact on yield or production of any of these warm season annuals. So make sure you are planting into a clean, weed-free, prepared seed bed. Now, I mentioned our cool season forages earlier. They're not nearly as commonly utilized for hay production as our warm season perennials. Once again, because we are having to plant them on an annual basis. But the other reason often is that the appropriate time to harvest annual ryegrass or our small grains for hay, we do tend to have quite a bit of moisture in that winter, early springtime period in various parts of our state. So that can be very challenging as far as harvesting them for a dry hay crop. Annual ryegrass, we may have some volunteer annual ryegrass in our warm season perennial hay meadows and our Baja grass or Bermuda grass. One of my recommendations for managing or controlling any of that volunteer ryegrass is to harvest it for a hay crop. A lot of producers will take what they refer to as a trash cutting, kind of in that April time period to remove any excess, any volunteer ryegrass, maybe even some winter weeds potentially, to open up that canopy to allow those warm seasons to break dormancy and to start actively growing. But oftentimes, if you do have some volunteer ryegrass, that quote unquote trash cutting may actually be higher in nutritive value than that first harvest of that warm season perennial hay. Because it is a cool season, it's naturally higher in nutritive value as long as it has not produced a seed head and kind of gone dormant or turned brown or quote unquote died, then it will still be higher in nutritive value compared to Bermuda grass, that first cutting of Bermuda grass or Baja grass. So there is an opportunity there. If you have pastures and you have excess annual ryegrass production that you're not able to graze down in a timely manner to allow Bermuda grass or Baja grass to break dormancy, you can always harvest that excess forage for a hay crop as well if you have the means. Once again, the biggest challenge is moisture at that time of year that can have an impact on accessing your fields and then getting that crop cured in order to bale it and then store it. But that can be an option. Legumes. Legumes are our highest quality forage that we can grow. This is some arrow leaf clover in East Texas. I often get questions about harvesting legumes. A lot of people utilize legumes to recycle nitrogen. If you're harvesting any fields where there are legumes for hay, just keep in mind that you are removing a majority of that nitrogen and you are not recycling that back into that specific location. You will recycle the nitrogen from those plants back wherever you feed that hay. So that can be beneficial for where you're feeding it, but you're not going to recycle nitrogen back into that specific hay meadow. Another challenge with harvesting legumes is the majority of the nutritive value is in that leaf material. So you do have to be concerned about leaf shatter. So as that plant cures, you're increasing the risk of losing some of that leaf material as you start to mow it and then bale it. So that's a very big challenge, and there's a thin line between having it cured and appropriate for harvesting and then leaf shatter. So that can be a challenging with any of our legumes that we might be harvesting or trying to harvest for hay. So I just wanted to point those out because I do get questions at times about utilizing legumes for hay production. So in summary, in regards to hay production in Central and East Texas, first and foremost, make sure you choose a forage species and variety that fits in your location based on your soil type, your rainfall. Keep in mind that many of these species and varieties can be picky in regards to where they will persist and be productive. So make sure you're getting the best recommendation. As always, to optimize forage production, yield, and nutritive value, fertilization is going to be an important aspect of that hay production system. So especially in a hay meadow, you need to be collecting soil samples on an annual basis, so every year, because you are removing a majority of those nutrients into those bales that you are baling and selling to someone or feeding to your own livestock on another part of your property. So make sure you are following soil test recommendations. And to optimize yield and nutritive value or quality, harvest at the appropriate time. To optimize both of those for Bermuda grass, the recommendation is every 3 to 4 weeks. 3 weeks if you are trying to produce quote unquote horse quality hay. Obviously, the longer you delay harvesting, you're going to have a higher yield. However, as those plants mature, you're going to decrease in nutritive value. So make sure you are following the best recommendations to optimize yield and nutritive value or quality. And then, of course, store your hay as best as you can in order to, to protect your investment, to protect that valuable crop that you have produced if you're not going to be selling it right away or feeding it right away. Of course, a barn, some sort of shelter is always best, but it may not be feasible or economical for your particular situation. There are some recommendations on storing hay appropriately outside and minimizing the impact of rainfall and moisture. One of the best things you can do is reduce ground exposure, so lifting those bales off of that dirt, off of the soil, so it's not soaking up additional moisture from the bottom. That tends to be where we have the most decay or loss of value, is from that forage sitting on wet soil or sitting in puddles. That is the conclusion of my presentation today. I do have a website. It is Forage Facts. Foragefacts.tamu.edu is an excellent source for forage information on soil testing, weed control, hay production, different Bermuda grass varieties, hopefully a wealth of information that might answer any forage related questions you might have. You can actually subscribe to this website. I typically post new information or an update addressing current events or topics or upcoming risk of issues on a weekly basis. So if you subscribe, you would receive an email on Fridays with that particular kind of newsletter. I try to keep them fairly brief. Most of us don't necessarily like to stare at a computer screen any longer than we might have to, but it is an excellent source of information if you have any forage questions. You can also locate my contact information, my phone number, and my email address if you have additional forage questions. I'm always happy to help. Thank you.